Picture this. July 4th, 1961. The depths of the Atlantic. A Soviet submarine, armed with nuclear missiles, is turning into a floating hell. The reactor has failed, temperatures are soaring past the red line, and radiation is destroying the crew right at their posts. And just a few miles away, NATO ships that might mistake an explosion for the start of World War III. Have you ever heard of the K-19, the submarine that sailors nicknamed the Widowmaker? A ship that seemed to be trying to destroy its own crew. This story was hidden from the world for decades, a feat of heroism that may have prevented a nuclear apocalypse. What really happened on that fateful day off the coast of Norway? Why did the crew march towards certain death? And how did a handful of Soviet sailors save the planet from a catastrophe that few people still know about? Right now, I will tell you the whole truth about the K-19, a story of heroism that almost cost humanity its existence. Watch until the end. The truth about the price of this sacrifice will change the way you look at the history of the Cold War. But to understand how the crew ended up in this deadly trap in the middle of the ocean, we need to wind back the clock. Back to where the arms race forced engineers to achieve the impossible and make a fatal mistake. The late 1950s. The Cold War isn't just ongoing, it's heated to the limit. The world stood still, waiting to see who would blink first. And the weightiest argument in this silent dialogue of superpowers wasn't tanks or planes, but what was hidden beneath the water. Naval headquarters understood. The ocean is the perfect hiding place. Whoever could stealthily approach the enemy's shores and strike from the depths would gain a decisive advantage. This was a true revolution in shipbuilding, and unfortunately for the Soviet Union, the Americans took the first step. June 9th, 1959. At the shipyard in Groton, Connecticut, the USS George Washington is launched with great fanfare. It wasn't just another nuclear ship. It was the first true ballistic missile submarine in history. It could carry 16 Polaris missiles with nuclear warheads. For Moscow, it was a shock. Now, Soviet cities could be destroyed from 2,000 kilometers away, and the detection methods of the time were virtually powerless against such a threat. The response had to be immediate. Nikita Khrushchev demanded parity. Directives marked top secret and urgent flew to design bureaus. Thus, Project 658 was born, the first Soviet nuclear submarine with ballistic missiles. The future K-19. Her keel was laid in Severodvinsk. From that moment, a true production hell began. Usually, building a ship of this class took years, but there was no time. Designers, engineers, and ordinary workers labored in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, without weekends or holidays. The factory turned into an anthill, where they simultaneously welded the hull, mounted complex electronics, and installed 2 VMA-type nuclear reactors. The result of this race is staggering even today. The Americans built their George Washington in 586 days. The Soviet shipbuilders managed it in 359, almost twice as fast. It was a triumph of Soviet industry and human will. The boat left the slipway on October 11, 1959. It seemed time to open the champagne and celebrate. But such incredible speed had a downside. Haste is the enemy of quality. In the rush to meet deadlines, many processes were simplified, inspections were cut short, and minor defects were ignored. People worked to exhaustion, and the metal, it seemed, absorbed that fatigue. Even on the slipway, when the boat was just a pile of steel, strange things began to happen. Old sailors say that every ship has a soul, and sometimes that soul resists its own birth from the very beginning. The signs of trouble were everywhere, but no one wanted to notice them until it was too late. In naval history, there are unwritten laws that old salts honor more than the rulebook. One of them says, "The way a ship begins its life is how it will end it." The K-19 began its history with tragedies long before it touched the water. The rush at the Severodvinsk shipyards led to inevitable safety violations. People worked at the limit of human endurance, and sometimes they crossed it. While still in the shop, during the application of cork insulation to the hull, a fire broke out. Fire in a confined space spreads instantly. 2 workers could not get out. Later, while painting the tanks, paint fumes caused a painter to lose consciousness. The boat seemed to be resisting its birth, taking the lives of those who created it. In total, several people died during construction. Heavy talk began among the workers. Whispers spread that the metal was cursed. But Soviet ideology did not recognize mysticism. The party demanded the object be delivered. And so came the solemn day of the launch. October 11th, 1959. Admirals, designers, and Central Committee representatives lined up on the pier. An orchestra played. It seemed all troubles were behind them. Only one beautiful naval tradition remained: to break a bottle of champagne against the ship's bow. This is the symbolic baptism of a vessel, a wish of good luck to the crew. Usually, the bottle is tied to a long rope and swung with force against the steel stem. Splashes of foam, the sound of breaking glass, applause. But K-19 was a special boat. Her hull, for the first time in the Soviet fleet, was covered with a special rubber layer, an anti-sonar coating. This made the boat less visible to enemy radar, but it played a cruel joke on tradition. The engineering officer, Mechanician Panov, swung. The bottle flew toward the side. Everyone froze in anticipation of the loud pop. But instead, there was a dull, rubbery thud. The champagne bounced off the soft skin like a ball, and without breaking, rolled down the slipway. For a moment, absolute silence hung in the air. The sailors looked at each other. The officers' faces darkened. For a man who has tied his life to the sea, this is the worst omen possible. They say a ship that does not accept its baptism will be unlucky until the day it's scrapped. Someone present quietly said, "She'll show her true colors yet." Of course, this moment was cut from the official newsreels. Political officers conducted explanatory work, saying superstitions have no place in the Navy of the nuclear age. They eventually broke the bottle on the second attempt, but the bitter taste remained. The crew, formed from the fleet's best specialists, felt this weight. They understood they were to serve on a ship that had gone against fate from the start. Despite the grim omens, the order was given. The lines were cast off. The nuclear giant slowly moved away from the pier, cutting through the leaden waves of the White Sea. Ahead were state trials in the cold depths of the Atlantic, where the crew would find out what those superstitions were actually worth. June 1961, the North Atlantic. K-19 is submerged, cutting through the water at depth. This was no longer just a voyage, but participation in massive exercises codenamed Polar Circle. The task was ambitious and daring. Pass stealthily through the Danish Straits, enter the Atlantic Ocean, slip under the Arctic pack ice, and, surfacing in the designated area, simulate a missile strike on a mock enemy. Essentially, the crew was practicing the scenario for the start of World War III. For the Soviet Navy, this was a quantum leap. Previously, diesel boats were forced to surface regularly to recharge batteries, risking detection by radar. But a nuclear ship was a true ghost. 2 reactors provided unlimited energy. The boat could stay submerged for months. It was a true marvel of technology. 114 meters of steel, packed with the most advanced electronics, D-2 ballistic missiles, and torpedoes. Inside the pressure hull, life went on as usual. To the uninitiated, service on a submarine seems like a hell of confined space. But for the professionals who had gone through the harsh school of diesel boats, K-19 felt like a spaceship. There was clean air regenerated by special units, stable temperatures, desalinated water, hot showers, and even a movie projector in the wardroom. The crew, handpicked from the best of the Northern Fleet, was proud of their ship. They called her affectionately and with respect, the Swallow. The boat was commanded by Captain Second Rank Nikolai Zateyev, an experienced, tough, but fair commander who knew his ship down to the last screw. Under his command, 139 men stood watch, relieving each other every 4 hours. The hum of the turbines became a familiar background, the heartbeat of the ship that calmed and gave confidence. It seemed the power of the atom, locked in the reactor compartment, was fully under human control. But it is here, far from native shores, under millions of tons of ice-cold water, that a dangerous illusion arises. The illusion of absolute invulnerability. When you control such a behemoth, capable of destroying a city, you begin to feel like the master of the ocean. The depth hides you, the reactor gives heat and light, and the fixed steel protects you from pressure. Sailors relax, believing in the reliability of instruments and automation. None of them could imagine that the most terrifying enemy was not outside, where NATO destroyers prowled, but inside, behind the lead bulkhead of the sixth compartment. By early July, the exercises entered their active phase. The boat maneuvered, changed depth, and performed tasks. Everything went according to plan. The engineers reported, parameters normal. Navigators plotted the course on the map. July 4th, 4 a.m. The watch had just changed. Most of the crew was resting. Silence reigned in the compartments, broken only by the steady hum of ventilation. It seemed nothing portended disaster. But at 4:15 a.m., that silence was shattered by a sound that every submariner hopes never to hear in reality. The sound of the emergency alarm, announcing the beginning of the end. July 4th, 4 hours and 15 minutes in the morning. In the central command post of the K-19, the duty shift monitored the instruments. Suddenly, the silence was ripped apart by the sharp, pulsating sound of the emergency siren, the howler. Everyone in the Navy knows this sound. It means the ship's life is being counted in minutes, or even seconds. On the main propulsion control panel, warning lights flashed. The watch engineer mechanic could not believe his eyes. The pressure gauge needle for the starboard primary cooling loop, which should have shown a stable 200 atmospheres, flickered and plummeted to zero. It was impossible. It couldn't happen by definition. But the gauge wasn't lying. The pressure in the reactor's primary loop had vanished. For those not familiar with nuclear physics, let me explain the scale of the catastrophe. The VMA reactor is the heart of the boat, a glowing furnace where uranium rods heat water under massive pressure. As long as water circulates, it carries heat away to the turbines. But if the pressure drops, the water instantly boils, turning into steam. And steam, unlike liquid, is terrible at carrying heat away. Cooling stops. The core begins to heat itself. Engineering officer Anatoly Kozyrev and Division Commander Yuri Poviev instantly assessed the situation. Somewhere in the depths of the reactor compartment, a pressure sensor tube had burst. Through a microscopic crack, the coolant blasted out, turning into radioactive steam. The system was sealed, but now it was empty. The automatic protection worked as designed. The emergency shutdown rods slammed down, stopping the uranium fission chain reaction. The reactor was shut down. But you can't cheat physics. Even in a shut-down reactor, decay heat continues. The fuel elements, by inertia, continue to generate a colossal amount of heat. They need cooling, a constant flow of water. Otherwise, the temperature will reach the melting point of the metal. The mechanics started the main circulation pumps, trying to push the remaining water through the core. But the pumps, designed to move dense liquid, only beat helplessly against the thin steam. They seized. Circulation stopped completely. The temperature in the core climbed with frightening speed. 100 degrees. 200. 300. The needles moved into the red zone. Captain Zatayev demanded a report. The engineer's answer sounded like a death sentence. There was simply no onboard emergency system for reactor cooling in the event of a total primary loop failure. This was the moment when the genius of Soviet designers collided with harsh reality. In the design of K-19, they had considered fires, floods, and electrical failures. But a scenario where the coolant completely leaks out and the pumps stop was considered so improbable that a special system for injecting water from the outside was simply never installed. The damage control manual was silent on this point. The situation was becoming critical. the temperature crossed 800 degrees Celsius. The uranium rods began to melt, deform, and flow down to the bottom of the reactor vessel. The radiation levels in the reactor compartment rose hundreds of times over in minutes. The gamma sensors went off the charts. Zatayev understood. If the molten fuel burned through the reactor vessel and met the water, a thermal explosion would occur. It would destroy not only the compartment, but the boat's pressure hull. And on board, missiles with nuclear warheads and torpedoes. An explosion of such magnitude in the Atlantic would be comparable to the detonation of a tactical nuclear charge. There was no time left for reflection. The boat was turning into a radioactive oven. And then, in that hell of steam and sirens, a solution was born. One that was not in any textbook. A solution that was insane, desperate, and the only one possible. A heavy silence hung in the central post. Engineering officer Anatoly Kozyrev laid the piping diagram before Captain Zatayev. A solution had been found, but it seemed like madness. The engineers proposed mounting a makeshift cooling line right there at sea, using spare parts and pipes. The idea was technically brilliant and simultaneously suicidal. They needed to cut off a vent valve on the reactor lid and weld a pipe to it, connected to the ship's fresh water supply. This would allow them to pump cold water directly into the glowing core and drop the temperature. But there was one problem. To perform this welding, someone had to enter the reactor compartment, right where the radiation levels already exceeded all imaginable limits. There was no protection against gamma radiation of that intensity on the boat. Light chemical suits and gas masks could protect against radioactive dust, but to hard radiation, they were as transparent as paper. Zatayev knew. He couldn't just order men to their certain deaths. He explained the situation. The reactor is about to explode. If it does, not only the crew will die, a radioactive cloud will cover Scandinavia, and the explosion will be seen as an attack. Volunteers are needed. Lieutenant Boris Korchalov, the group commander, stepped forward first. He was only 20 years old, handsome, a top student, with a fiancée waiting at home. Two others followed him, Petty Officer Yuri Ordachkin and Petty Officer Evgeny Kashenkov. They understood the physics. They knew the dose they would receive in the minutes spent working at the reactor lid would be incompatible with life. The work began. The emergency party split into groups of 3. Each group was to work inside for no more than 10 minutes. But in that hell, time flowed differently. Nightmare reigned in the reactor compartment. Due to the massive ionizing radiation, the air glowed with an eerie, bluish-violet light. It was scorching hot. Steam hissed from leaks. In this environment, in clumsy rubber suits, by the light of portable lamps, the sailors began cutting and welding. Welding is a delicate task, requiring a steady hand. Now imagine holding an electrode while billions of radioactive particles pierce your body, destroying cells, causing nausea and dizziness. But weld by weld, inch by inch, the pipeline was assembled. When the first trio, led by Lieutenant Korchalov, stepped out of the compartment, their comrades recoiled in horror. These were not the same men who had entered 20 minutes ago. Their faces were swollen and had taken on a deep reddish-brown hue, the so-called nuclear tan. Capillaries were bursting under the skin from instant destruction. They were vomiting, barely able to stand. They had taken the blow intended for the whole world, but they had achieved the main goal. The pipeline was welded. The commander gave the order to start the pump. The water flowed. The thermometer needles flickered and slowly, reluctantly, began to move down. The core temperature started to drop. The threat of a thermal explosion had passed. The reactor was cooled at the cost of the health and lives of a handful of sailors who used their bodies to plug the nuclear breach. However, while they celebrated this bitter victory inside, the situation outside was only beginning to heat up. The boat had lost power, communication was failing, and the silhouettes of foreign ships were already appearing on the horizon. Having escaped the enemy within, radiation, the K-19 was now face-to-face with the enemy without. The Cold War showed no mercy to the wounded, and the American military already had the Soviet submarine in its sights. While the struggle against the invisible enemy, radiation, took place inside the hull, a drama of a different scale was unfolding outside. K-19 had lost propulsion. She was drifting in neutral waters, but geographically, it was the worst place for an accident. The boat was only 100 miles from John Mayen Island. This patch of land housed a strategic NATO station, intercept antennas, radars, and airfield. The American military could clearly see on their screens the Soviet submarine that had suddenly stopped and gone silent. To them, it looked like preparation for a strike or a strange maneuver. The situation was worsened by a communication problem. The long-range antenna on K-19 had failed during a storm. The backup transmitter had a short range. Captain Zadiev sent encrypted messages to fleet headquarters, hoping someone of his own would hear the distress signal. But the airwaves were silent. Moscow did not answer, but others did. A silhouette appeared on the horizon. First a dot, then the predatory profile of a warship. It was not a Soviet rescuer. An American destroyer was approaching the drifting submarine at full speed. Later, several more NATO ships joined it. U.S. Navy helicopters began circling over K-19. They hovered low over the sail, pilots taking photos of the steam venting from the ventilation. The destroyer signaled via semaphore and radio on an open frequency. "We see you are in trouble. Ready to provide assistance. We can take on your crew, provide food and medical support." It seemed like salvation. The people on board were irradiated, the reactor was unstable, and there was no help from their own side. But Nikolai Zadiev understood. In the Cold War, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Accepting American help meant handing over the newest missile carrier. Secret codes, cipher tables, the reactor design, ballistic missiles. All of it would become a Pentagon trophy. It would be an indelible stain on the flag and high treason. The commander made a hard decision. He ordered the boat prepared for scuttling. If the Americans tried to board or take K-19 by force, the crew was to open the Kingston valves. The nuclear missile carrier would go to the bottom with its people and secrets. But it would not go to the probable enemy. Tension on board reached a peak. Some officers and sailors, exhausted by fear and radiation, began to murmur. Zadiev realized that panic could be more dangerous than the accident. He gathered all the small arms, Makarov pistols, Kalashnikov rifles, and threw them overboard. He kept only 5 pistols, for himself and his most trusted officers. It was a gesture of both desperation and strength. He made it clear. There would be no mutiny, and we will not surrender the boat. The American destroyer moved very close, staying within firing range. Their guns were trained on K-19. Our submariner stood on the bridge, looking into the eyes of those who could destroy or save them in a minute. And at that moment, when hope had almost vanished, the sonar operator reported, "I hear propeller noise. Bearing. It's one of ours, a diesel boat." Out of the fog emerged the sail of the Soviet diesel submarine S-270, commanded by Captain Sverdlov. It had been patrolling the area and miraculously intercepted the weak distress signal. It was like a movie. A small diesel boat stood between the massive nuclear cruiser and the NATO armada, shielding its wounded comrade. The threat of capture had passed. But now, the captains of the 2 Soviet boats faced a task no one had ever practiced in exercises: how to transfer 150 irradiated, sick people from one ship to another in the open, stormy ocean. The operation to evacuate the crew from the crippled K-19 to the diesel S-270 entered the textbooks of naval practice as an example of incredible courage and skill. Imagine the Atlantic, a Force 3 or 4 storm. 2 steel giants dancing on the waves, risking a collision that would crush their hulls. Diesel boat captain Zon Sverdlov showed miracles of maneuvering. He brought his ship almost flush against the rocking nuclear missile carrier. Ropes and gangways were thrown between the sails. The transfer began. The most critical were passed first, those from the emergency party. When the hatch opened and the sailors of S-270 took Lieutenant Korchalov and his team into their arms, they couldn't stop shivering. Young, healthy guys they might have played soccer with just yesterday were unrecognizable. Their faces were swollen to the point where their eyes were mere slits. Their speech was slurred, their movements sluggish. Radiation was destroying their bodies with terrifying speed. But even in this state, they tried to walk on their own, refusing stretchers until their strength finally failed. The rest followed. 79 people crammed into the tight compartments of the small diesel boat, which wasn't designed for such a passenger load. Men lay in the passageways, on torpedo racks, sitting shoulder to shoulder. But the most terrifying part wasn't the crowding. The clothes, shoes, and hair of the K-19 submariners were radioactive. They carried invisible death with them. Dosimetrists on the S-270 watched their instruments in horror. The needles were climbing on their ship now. The rescuers understood. By taking on the crew of the Hiroshima, they were becoming hostages to radiation themselves. But no one said a word. Naval brotherhood proved stronger than the fear of the invisible beam. Nikolai Zateyev was the last to leave the K-19. He personally walked through the empty compartments, checked that no one was left behind, secured the hatches, and sealed the bridge. Looking back at his orphaned ship, he stepped onto the rescue boat's deck. K-19 was left drifting in the ocean, a grim, radioactive ghost of the Cold War. The journey back to base was agonizing. A silence reigned in the overcrowded compartments, broken only by the groans of those who were suffering most. Doctors did what they could, but the ship's medical kit had no remedies for radiation sickness of such severity. When the boat arrived at Polyarny, they were met not by an orchestra and flowers, but by a KGB cordon and ambulances. There were more people in hazmat suits than admirals. The heroes of the emergency party were carried off on stretchers and immediately loaded into special transport. They were sent to Moscow, to the Institute of Biophysics. Unfortunately, medicine at the time was powerless. The radiation doses received by the welders while installing the pipe were 3 to 4 times the lethal limit. Boris Korchalov, Yuri Ordachkin, Evgeny Kashenkov, and other members of the emergency party died in agony within weeks of the accident. They burned from the inside out. But they saved their comrades, and quite possibly, the world. They were buried in sealed lead coffins, in a cemetery in Moscow, under conditions of the strictest secrecy. Families were forbidden from saying where or how their sons and husbands had died. In official documents, the diagnosis of acute radiation sickness was replaced with vague phrasing. The feat was accomplished, but the country chose to hide it. And what of the boat itself? One would think such a ship should be scrapped immediately, encased in concrete, forgotten like a nightmare. But the Soviet command had other plans. The Widowmaker would return to service. After the last of the victims were taken to the Moscow clinic, a heavy curtain of secrecy fell over the story. In the Soviet Union, accidents of this scale officially did not exist. The newspapers were silent, and a sense of fear and unspoken words settled into the families of the submariners. All surviving crew members, including Captain Nikolai Zateyev, were forced to sign strict non-disclosure agreements for 25 years. They were forbidden from telling the truth, even to their own wives. The heroism of the men who saved the world from a nuclear war was erased by the censor's eraser. The award recommendations for Hero of the Soviet Union were rewritten at the top. The country preferred to forget this inconvenient incident. And what about the Widowmaker itself? The boat was towed into a bay. She stood at the pier, sinister and dark, emitting so much radiation that people were afraid to approach without protection. It seemed the ship's fate was sealed. Decommission, dismantle, bury in a landfill. But the logic of the Cold War dictated otherwise. Building a nuclear missile carrier cost colossal amounts of money. Khrushchev, upon hearing of the accident, reportedly said, "We have no spare nuclear submarines." The order was clear: decontaminate, restore, and return to service. a unique and macabre operation began. The damaged reactor compartment, along with the molten fuel, was simply cut out of the hull entirely and dumped in the Kara Sea. A new compartment with new reactors was welded in its place. The boat was modernized, renamed, and given a new tactical number, hoping to cheat fate. But sailors have long memories. In the fleet, the boat was firmly given a terrifying, unofficial nickname: Hiroshima. And unfortunately, the boat fully lived up to that name. It was as if a dark curse followed the K-19. In 1969, she collided while submerged with an American submarine. The impact was terrifying, but the pressure hull held. And 3 years later, in 1972, a horrific fire broke out on board, taking the lives of another 28 sailors. Men died in the compartments, suffocating from smoke, but they saved the ship. Hiroshima continued to serve, collecting its sad toll until 1990. She served for 30 years. For 30 years, this ship, born in haste and baptized in radiation, went to sea, keeping both its crew and the probable enemy on edge. It was a unique case in world history. A ship that survived a core meltdown remained a frontline combat unit. Only in the 90s, when the secrecy was lifted, did the survivors begin to speak. Nikolai Zadiev, by then retired, wrote his memoirs. Until his final days, he fought for the recognition of his men's heroism. He wanted the world to know the names of those who entered that glowing compartment. The story of K-19 is not just a chronicle of accidents. It is a mirror of an entire era. An era when human life was merely a consumable material in the great game of superpowers. But even in this rigid system, there was room for something greater than just an order. In 2003, at the Nerpa shipyard, the official history of the K-19 ended. Her hull, eaten by salt and time, was finally cut for scrap. It seemed the final period had been placed. But one of the ship's former sailors, who had by then become a successful businessman, bought part of the boat's sail and installed it on the shore of the Pilovskoye Reservoir near Moscow. Now, it is a memorial, the only physical reminder of a ship that once held half the planet in fear and nearly destroyed the other half. For a long time, the world knew this story only from Hollywood blockbusters. But for those who were there, in the fourth compartment in July of '61, reality was far more terrifying and simple than any movie. These men didn't consider themselves heroes. They were just doing their job, fulfilling their oath, and protecting their comrades. But the price of that job proved beyond measure. In 2006, Mikhail Gorbachev officially petitioned the Nobel Committee to nominate the crew of the K-19 for the Peace Prize. His argument was simple. The heroism of these sailors prevented an accidental nuclear conflict at the height of the Cold War. They were not awarded the prize, but for history, that no longer mattered. The main recognition came later, when the surviving veterans could finally gather together and speak aloud the names of those who did not return from their final voyage. Today, looking at the photographs from those years, we see young men with open faces. They loved life, made plans, and dreamed of returning home. But when the moment of truth came, not one of them flinched. They entered that radioactive hell, not for the medals they would only receive decades later, and not for the fame that secrecy would steal from them. They did it because there was no other way. The story of the Widowmaker is a harsh lesson for all of humanity. It is a reminder of how dangerous it is to neglect safety for the sake of political ambition. A reminder of how easily technology created for protection can turn into a deadly trap. But above all, it is a story that even in the darkest hour, when hope seems lost, the human spirit proves stronger than any armor. K-19 no longer goes to sea. The reactors are silent. The missile silos are empty. But the echo of that emergency howler still rings in the memory of those who know the true price of peace. Submariners say that ships do not vanish without a trace. They continue their eternal voyage in the celestial ocean. And there, on the bridge of a phantom cruiser, Captain Zetayev and his faithful emergency party remain forever on watch, guarding our peace. We are obligated to remember them, not just as victims of high politics, but as people who in the decisive moment chose life for others by sacrificing their own. This is the true greatness of the Navy, not in the caliber of guns or the power of engines, but in the people whose hearts beat in unison with the heart of the ship until the very end. Thank you for walking this path with us until the end. The story of the K-19 is just one of many secrets hidden beneath the water. If you are interested in the fate of great ships and the people who commanded them, subscribe to the channel. We have many more dives into the depths of history ahead, where the truth sometimes turns out to be more incredible than any fiction. See you in the next episode.